Hello and welcome back. In today's lesson, we'll be looking at snapshots 6, 7 and 8. At the high level, we'll be working on implementing the functionality fully for our application. Also, we'll be refining some of them, which we have already built. Most of the major building blocks are already in place, such as the UI, also the code that retrieves the XML from the internet. The database is set up, and we've also done some binding. Now we have to fully implement them and tie them together. We'll first run snapshot number 6 to show you what we've managed to do in this snapshot. What we are concentrating on in this snapshot was making the relationship between the folder combo box, the channel, the list box and the news item list box, as well as binding the more detailed controls on the right hand side here and getting them all to work together properly. Now, if I select blog feeds from the folder combo box, it will show me only those channels that are associated with that particular folder. If we changed it to tech news, then the channels change, and if I select a certain channel, it will display only those news items that are associated with that channel. When we select a news item, the associate properties are displayed for that particular news item, as well as the web page and web browser controls. So now let's look at some of the code which enables this to work. Whenever we banned these controls, it automatically created some code in the main form load event. Some of that has been revised, and this code is quite simple. It takes each of the table adapters and it fills the appropriate data table and the dataset with data from the database. So the table adapter, if you remember from lessons 8 and 9, is that it acts as a go-between between the database and your dataset. So the database is your long-term persistent storage mechanism. The file on your hard drive and dataset is the memory version of that data. So when we make changes to the dataset, these will then be communicated back into the underlying database through the use of the same table adapter. So I've removed the channel table adapters and put it into its own helper method. So in lines 165 to 172, there's the private void refresh channel, which is the private helper method which I made so we don't have to constantly call this code. Initially, I checked to see if the channel data table contains any values or rows. If not, then I want to fill it up. So we call the channel table adapter, fill passing in the dataset, and we're to fill up the channel data table with some data from the database. When we've done this, we want to only display those channels that are associated with the current folder. So we first need to make sure that something has been selected in the folder combo box. If nothing's been selected, then we ignore this refresh channels method. So we'll do a check to make sure nothing's gone or can go wrong. So if it's not null, then we want to filter out all of the channel binding source records. So the job of the binding source is to make sure that the values in the dataset is correctly shown in the UI. There's a filter method, so we can filter out those records in our data table that meet some criteria. Here the criteria we're setting is to see only those channels where the folder ID is equal to whatever selected folder combo box selection is. We'll filter out only those channels where the folder ID, the foreign key, is equal to whatever has been selected in the folder combo box. This we're calling from the main form, but it'll also be called from other places in our form at different times. We did a similar thing for the news item. We created another helper method called private void refresh news items. So I'm only filling up the news item data table if there's no rows in the news item data table. So that's on lines 178, 179, 180. We're doing the same thing in lines 182 and 183. Where we're only displaying those news items where the channel ID, the foreign key, is equal to the current selection in the channels list box. So I only want to display the news items in that list box that correspond to the selection made in this list box. So here we have two helper methods. Refresh channels and refresh news items. So when a selection is made in the combo box and whenever the selected index of the folder combo boxes change, we need to remove certain things. So we'll remove the refresh news channels. Once we have the selected channels for the given folder displayed, then we'll refresh the news items, because there'll be at least one channel there, which means only one will be selected. And we will want to display the news items for the selected channel. This is also the case if the channel list box is clicked. That will fire off the channel list box selected in Exchange. Here we'll only fire off the refresh news items, so no need to call the refresh channels as nothing's changed in the folder box. We'll do a similar thing in the news items list box. So when a news item is selected, we need to ensure that the correct record is displayed. So we'll look at the code and make sure that the selected index is something and not -1. If there is an actual selection in the news item list box, then we'll work with that news item binding source. So the purpose of the binding source is to make sure that the data being displayed on the form is the data that is being pointed to by ADO.NET behind the scenes. The specific record, that is the current record. So we set the position of that news item binding source equal to the current selected index from our news item list box. When we selected news item, it fires off this event, which then sets the binding source position to the currently selected item. To display data, you just go to the properties of each of these controls, to the data section at the bottom, select data bindings and set the text property by finding the news item binding source and selecting the title for the title text box, the description for the description text boxes, etc. So now we can display things on screen in an organized fashion. So after an hour and a half of work, we're looking at snapshot number 7. The purpose of snapshot number 7 was to join together the two biggest pieces of the puzzle. How to get the data we're taking from the internet into the database. So a huge challenge was to ensure the code that I had for the RSS manager would not be permanently bound to this application. I could remove from this application and use it in other places. This is called low coupling in object-oriented terms. I don't want to couple my implementation, the RSS manager, with this application. If I do and then wanted to use it in another application, then I'd basically have to start all over again. So up until now in the RSS manager, we hadn't implemented the data. How would we save data in the database? So could I store the data in the database directly from my refresh RSS? So I didn't want to include the functionality of saving data into the database from this method, even though I had it at the bottom in my comments. I didn't want to do this because it would tie me to this implementation of the process newsfeed. I would always have to use the RSS MDF database. Now say later I just wanted to display the newsfeed in the database and not save it, I couldn't. So there were lots of issues, and the solution was that I wanted to use this process newsfeed method to just retrieve all of the latest RSS news items from the internet. Then some other code would save the data into the database for my application. So I had to see how I could package all this data and send it back outside. The solution was that I created a new class in my same RSS Manager file. So this actual file, the RSS Manager.cs file, or any .cs file, can contain multiple classes. So I have a class called NewsItem now, which I just created in the snapshot, as well as the class RSS Manager, which I've defined below in the same place. The NewsItem class here is just a structure. It'll just contain the title, a link, and a description. Basically the three pieces that make up each individual news item. As we take the RSS feeds from the internet, we'll look through each individual item and put them into one of these news item objects and then add them to an array list, rather than displaying them in a message box. An array list is a collection of anything, so here it can be a collection of each news item object. So if there's 5 news items through some of the channels that we have subscribed to, then we'd create an array list that contains 5 individual news items. After we've passed the array list back from this method, the code that originally called the newsfeed can then loop through each of the individual news item objects in the array list. Then it can start saving the data in the database. Now I've changed the method signature for the refresh RSS, which I've renamed to process newsfeed, so that it returns back an array list. I've used the fully qualified namespace for the system.collections.arraylist. It still accepts the RSS URL. Here we've created a return array list. This is basically what we return at the very bottom after we've passed out all of the individual news items that will be passed back to the code that called the method. Here I've commented out these temporary title, link and description placeholders, as I no longer need them. So instead, when I go through the process of passing through the XML, I'm going to create a new instance of the news item object that I just created and I showed you in the snapshot at the very top of the same file. I called this temp news item. I then populate temp news item.title and temp news item.link and temp news item.description with the values that I'm pulling down from the XML file, the rss.xml. I then use the add method of the return array list, passing in the newly populated temp news item object. Once I've added a good number of temp news items, I return this whole list of news items back to the code that called it. So we'll look at that code. I put the functionality in its own helper method, pre-channels. So we'll go to definition. It might be an idea to put it in its own class later on. So here I've begun to loop through each channel as I have to know the URL for the channel so that I can call my new process newsfeed method, which I do here. For each channel, it will pass in URL. We've removed hard-coded msdn.microsoft.com/rss.xml and replace it with anything that comes from the database that is currently stored in the channel data table dataset. The process newsfeed then returns an array list which is filled with a load of news items. So we'll roll through each news item that is currently collected in the array list that we'll retrieve from the process newsfeed. With each individual news item, we'll do some checks. First, we'll ensure the length is not too long. We'll remove the single quote marks because sometimes you have quote marks in literal strings. It messes up our insert of the database. After this, I'll create a filter expression. So basically, I already have all the news items in my data set that I retrieved whenever I started up the application. That's what the refresh news item helper method did. We have a fully populated news item data table. So basically, there's a new list of news items which I just got from the internet. Some of these will overlap, but we only want to save the ones that we don't already have. So to do this, I took this filter expression, so it only gave me those news items where the title equals the current title for the current news item that we're looping through. we'll use the select method of our news item data table to find if we already have that news item saved in our database. If it's there, then we don't want to save it. So if the filter news items dot length, so if the length of the array is returned back from the selection process, returns an array of data rows into something called filtered news items. If the length equals 0, then we need to add it to the databases here. So make sure the item's not already in the database. If it isn't, then we'll create a new row in our dataset and save it into our dataset. So we basically created a new instance of a news item row, and we begin to set the title, description and link, the channel ID, the date acquired, and then take that new row object and call the news item row method of the news item data table. Up until now, nothing's been saved to the database. Everything's currently temporarily stored in the dataset. To save them back to the database, we would have to call news item table adapter.update. The update method is what will take all the changes which were made to the dataset. Any number of those changes get propagated back into the database. New records get saved, edited records and deleted records. All these happen at the point we call update. So now let's run our application. We may get some errors, but hopefully everything we just did will get saved in the database. I've already run this once or twice, so you'll see there are already some items in here. When I click this, new items are added to the bottom of our list. We could check this and delete all the data out using the Database Explorer. So that was snapshot number 7. We'll now look at snapshot number 8. What we want to do is implement the channel and folder dialog so they work correctly. We'll run the application to show you how it all comes together. So we'll create a new folder and call this News. Click OK. Select News and click Add Channel. MSN Top News, and I'll paste the link and click OK. Once I add a channel, it will do a refresh and grab down the RSS for all the channels. So my editing is working. So I'll edit News and call this Top News. You'll see it changes in the folder. Then I'll change and edit the channel MSN Top News and may just put Good in my favorites. That also changes. I can also delete the channel, and a dialog pops up asking, are you sure you want to delete the channel? Doing so will also delete the news items. So you select yes and it deletes it, and you can also delete the folder. This says, are you sure you want to delete the current folder? Doing so will delete all the channels and messages contained in it. We've enabled a lot of functionality in this snapshot. So we took 2 different approaches for the folder and the channel. To begin with, the folder, I create help methods for each of the adding, editing and deleting functions for folders and channels. This is because rather than implementing all the code behind here for this particular button, there may be some menu items later that I want to include and do exactly the same thing. Or there may be some keyboard shortcuts that do this, and rather than copying and pasting the exact same code and putting it elsewhere, it's better to create a helper method and then point to the helper method from each place and code I need to call. This is actually a best practice that you should never write the same code twice or have it copied and pasted in multiple places. So in the Add folder, right-click and select and go to Definitions. Further down the same file. You could even put it in its own class, it's up to you. We'll now talk about the strategy that we're using for the dialog. So we'll key off for the folder ID. If the folder ID is 0, we're telling the dialog that we want to create a new folder or new channel when we're working with the channel dialog. If the folder ID is greater than 0, then we'll be editing an existing folder or channel. So we'll just look at how the folder dialog has changed. It looks about the same visually, but it's very different under the hood in the code. I've added 2 public properties and 2 private fields. A form is similar to any class, so I just added 2 extra properties to this form. I did this because I need a way of communicating the values back and forth between the main form.cs and the folder dialog.cs. I could have chosen many different strategies to do this, but this is what I opted for. So there's 2 bits of information which I'm displaying and changing from the folder dialog, folder ID and the folder name. Each of these properties also have their underlying private fields. Let's look at the load method for our folder dialog. We've set the dialog results on the buttons themselves, but also did it here in code. So as the form's loading, I want to set the folder ID text box and the folder name text box to the values that are currently being stored in my private fields. So let's see how they get populated. Looking back at our main form.cs, whenever I create a new instance of my folder dialog, the first thing I do is set the folder ID property equal to 0. I could have set the folder name equal to an empty string, but as we're adding a new folder, we don't want there to be anything in the folder name text box. As soon as creating a new instance of the folder dialog, we'll set those 2 properties which we created so we can pass in values. Whenever we're editing the folder, we need to pass in a folder ID and the folder name, so they are actually reflected as they're displayed to the user. The rest of this code should look quite similar. We're getting a dialog result based on whether the user clicked OK or cancel. If they clicked OK, now we have a fully implemented version of this method. So here we're creating a new folder row for our folder data table. We'll populate the folder name into that folder row by grabbing its value from its public property on our reference to our folder dialog. Because there is a public method, we can take it out and use it here. So we set one of the columns for our folder data table row, and we'll use the add folder row method, passing in our new folder row. Then we called the update method to actually make that stick into the underlying database. This is also the case for the edit folder, create a new instance of the folder dialog. And on this occasion, we're going to get the current folder ID that's selected in the folder combo box. We'll find this row in the folder data table by using this find by folder ID, passing in the folder ID. So how does it know to create a method called find by folder ID? A benefit of creating primary key within our databases is that whenever we create a data set from it, that dataset creation process will create a number of helper methods which will help us search and find specific rows or pieces of information based on the primary key. So this happens behind the scenes that Visual C# 2005 Express Edition takes care of for us, like whenever it creates this RSS dataset definition. If we double click and can look at it, it shows us a couple of things here that the methods of the table adapter doesn't show us everything. There's a lot more helper methods being created behind the scenes. So by passing in the folder ID, we'll get the one row in our folder data table for the corresponding one selected by the user. Here we populate the folder ID and the folder name, the properties of our folder dialog reference. Then these should seem quite familiar. We'll then tell that folder row that we're going to edit it and give it a new name. We'll then say we've finished editing and call the update method and put it in the database. And that's how the folder dialog works. The channel dialog works differently. Unlike the folder dialog, which doesn't have anything in the designer tray, here we can see some dataset, channel adapter, folder table adapter, and 2 binding sources. In this implementation, the main form.cs was responsible for saving the data, but here I have given that responsibility to the channel properties form itself. I did it differently to show you two different implementations. You can choose either one or something different. So we'll just quickly look at some of the code. I've taken the same approach where I've created two private fields and then two public methods to retrieve the channel ID and the folder ID. The channel ID is going to be the primary key and the folder ID is the foreign key for the relationship between the current folder selected and the channel. So we can populate the list of folders in the drop-down list box here and our dialog, and then make sure the current one is selected. I also have a public property that allows us to pass in an instance of the dataset that we're currently working with in the main form.cs. We just want to use a reference to the existing dataset that we have in the main form. It wouldn't make sense to go and retrieve all the rows from the database and store them in the memory again. So let's pass in the one we already have. Once we're done, we can just close it down. So in the load event, similar to what it looked like in the folder dialog, setting the binding source, some of the information. If the channel ID is greater than 0, that means we're in edit mode. If not, then we're in adding mode. We'll set some information about the channel binding source. This will bind these fields, including the down list box, with all the folders based on what we retrieved from the folder binding source and the channel binding source. When the user clicks OK, we'll then either add or update. Again, we're using the scheme where the channel ID is 0. It means we're in add mode. If the channel ID is greater than 0, then we're editing an existing channel. In the case of adding, we'll create a new channel row called channel. We'll populate its folder ID, title, URL, last updated based on the selection the user's made. Then call the add channel row, passing in the new channel row. Here we can find the channel that we want to work with by using this find by channel ID, passing in the channel ID field. We'll start our edit, end our edit, and in between, change the folder ID, title, URL, and last updated to the values that were input by the user. I didn't call the update method here. I decided to leave that back out to the main form. On the main form, click on the Add Channel, go to Definition. We've created an instance of the channel dialog. We start setting its properties, set the data source equal to our instance of the dataset, set the channel ID and folder ID, and we called our show dialog method and grab back the results. Based on whether the user clicked OK or cancel, we either call the update method or we don't. And then once we have updated the database, then we call query channels. Query channels is that method which begins a process of refreshing the RSS feed by calling process newsfeed. So we've got a pretty well functioning application at the moment. It's not complete, but we'll save some more of these steps for our next snapshot. So thanks once again, and I will see you in the next lesson. Bye bye.